welcome to yet another edition of the Durham Bulls Podcast, where all of our Durham Bulls fans come to celebrate the tradition, the history of what is the Durham Bulls, whether it be Hall of Fame managers, players, general managers, or just people who kind of fill in the color and the fabric of Durham Bulls baseball. I'm Patrick Keenis, the broadcaster for the Bulls, and if it's the first time you're joining us, we thank you for coming. You can subscribe, and it would help out the pod a lot if you can do that. Subscribe on Spotify, subscribe on Apple, and you can actually watch this video version of our Durham Bulls podcast on our YouTube channel, Durham Bulls TV. Well, normally I would have a really long and flowy introduction for our next guest, but words don't do him justice. His voice does. So I'm just going to introduce the next guest on the Durham Bulls podcast and let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. This is Tony Riggsbee, the public address announcer for the Bulls and longtime friend of Patrick Keenis.
Wonderful. Spoken like a pro. So, Tony, first off, thanks for joining the broadcast. And you're joining us from a radio studio at a little before 11 a.m. And you've already put in a very, very long day. For the folks who may not know a little bit about your history in radio, can you give them a snapshot of what you've done? And
I've been in radio for 52 years now, Patrick. It certainly dates me, but I've done news and sports primarily for that entire period of time. And I still do morning news on WPTF in Raleigh and morning sports on the North Carolina News Network across the state. So I stay busy for an old man.
Do you like waking up at 4 a.m. or 3 a.m, or is this growing on you for the last 5 decades?
I've been doing it for about 5 decades, and I can't say I like the getting up part that much, but I like the getting off at 11 o'clock in the morning.
Well, but it leads to long days when the Bulls are in the middle of homestands because you're up at 3, 4 in the morning and you're not getting home, I would imagine, until 10:30 at night.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I do get home between the two, and I try to take a little bit of a nap every afternoon, and that makes me a lot more refreshed by the time I get to the ballpark and start job number 2 of the day.
All right, so let's start with your career with the Durham Bulls. We'll kind of bounce around your timeline because I have so many random questions to ask you, but you're an institution. You're a broadcast institution in the Triangle across the state, certainly an institution with the Durham Bulls in your time. Well, tell me about the day you were hired. You've been with the Bulls, 18 or 19 years now?
This is my 19th season now. Of course, I had been around the Bulls since they came back in 1980 as a radio reporter, and there was a stretch in 3 years in 86, 87, and 88 when I was the Bulls TV broadcaster, when we had a limited TV contract with what was then Durham Cablevision, later became Time Warner, and later Spectrum. And I used to fill in on Bulls radio some in the 80s and 90s, going back to the days when Gary Cohen, now the voice of the New York Mets, was the Bulls broadcaster. But I was always around as a reporter, getting tape and interviewing managers and stuff. And I got to know Miles Wolff, who's the owner of the Bulls in the 80s, very, very well. Particularly his number 2 man, Dave Chase, became a very good friend of mine. And they gave me a lot of access to the Bulls during my years as a reporter. I think Ron Morris, who was in with the Durham Morning Herald, and I were probably the 2 who had the most access to the Bulls back during the 1980s. And so I sort of became a semi-part of the family at that point, and I've loved it ever since. And then in the 2000s, Bill Law had become the PA announcer when the Bulls moved into the new ballpark back in 1995. And Bill was also the president of the Raleigh Hot Stove League. Well, we were longtime friends. I worked with him in the Hot Stove League. And right after the 2005 season, got a call from Matt DeMargel, who was then the media relations, promotions, and marketing director, handling all those jobs, saying that he and Mike Burling wanted to talk to me about replacing Bill because 2006 was going to be Bill's last season. So we worked that out, and in 2006, Bill and I split the job. So there wasn't a sharp demarcation. Bill's here today, and he's gone tomorrow. So Bill worked some of the games, I worked some of the games, and then starting in 2007, I did it solo.
So what was it like? I mean, what was this year? You grew up in Durham. You've been coming to Bulls games since the 60s. Was this ever the target? I mean, did you aspire when you're 7, 8, 9 years old that you wanted to be the voice of the Durham Bulls?
Well, I wanted to be in the press box when I was a kid. And that was a small press box at the old ballpark.
Yes, it was.
I know you've been down in there, but as a kid sitting up there, I was thinking that's where I want to be. I don't have enough talent to play baseball, but I want to be around baseball, and I'd love to be down in the press box, and I'd love to be that guy talking down there, either on radio or to the fans in the stands. But then I got involved in radio and so many different things, and it was always something that I had an interest in, but it was never anything that I actually pursued. They actually contacted me about it, and I've been lucky. A lot of my things in my life, I've been contacted, and it just worked out perfectly. And now it's home, and I can't imagine not doing it now.
It's interesting because I never really, when I was a kid, when I was 12, 13, 14 years old and showing some interest in this field, I never really understood that it was a career path. But I did. So I met Jack Brickhouse when I was an intern at WGN, and he was really the first one who said, just be a broadcaster. Don't pigeonhole yourself as wanting to be a play-by-play or a sports broadcaster, but be a broadcaster. And kind of at that stage, I realized that, this is a viable career path. It is, down a different road from law or from medicine, but it is a career path. And I'm so glad I had the opportunity to follow it. But because, like you, I was a talker when I was a kid, when I was in school. I got in trouble a lot for talking too much in school. Did you as well? I mean, did teachers throw you in the hallway and say, Tony, you got to be quiet?
The good thing, though, was in school when we would do oral readings, I had one of the teachers say, you ought to consider being a professional talker because you do so well on the oral readings. But, you mentioned the advice that Jack Brickhouse gave you. And I remember when you used to have those sportscaster camps, and you had me as a guest speaker, and I would tell some of those people something they didn't want to hear, which was, if you really want to be a broadcaster, learn how to do news and sports. That way it doubles the amount of jobs that you can have, and makes it more likely that you'll actually be in the business for a long time. And I've done both for half century now.
And you're fulfilled by both differently, right? I mean,
yes, exactly.
Explain what fulfills you about covering and reporting on news versus covering and reporting on sports.
Well, I think in both cases, I sort of approach sports as news, as a news event. And telling people about something that's going on has always been something I've really enjoyed, and trying to do it succinctly and making it understandable for people. So that's something that has always been very, very important to me. And, the legendary PA announcer for the New York Yankees, Bob Shepard, had a motto that I have always loved. And that was, Bob Shepard said, the role of a PA announcer is not to be a carnival barker, not to be a cheerleader, but to be a reporter. Report to the fans in the stands what is happening in that game. And I've always thought that was great advice.
So, I mean, so many different tangents where I would like to go. I guess number one is, with my job working in play-by-play, you can't help but listen to other play-by-play people within your industry. And you're not really critiquing, you're not really judging, but you're just kind of observing and perceiving certain things that they do that you like, things that they do that you don't like. Are you the same way when you're watching a game on TV or when you're at a different arena and listening intently to the PA announcer? Do you take notes? Do you assess? How does that land with you at a game?
Yeah, I think I do. And I go back, I mentioned Bob Shepard, but there were two other Major League PA announcers that I thought were just fantastic. One was Marshall Mann, who was the PA announcer for the Atlanta Braves about 25 years. Ironically, he also did a morning news shift too. So I sort of related to him at that point. And the other was the guy who was the PA announcer for the Cincinnati Reds for many years, Paul Summercamp. And they were both great traditional PA announcers with a lot of authority and gravitas, but yet they had a friendliness to their voice as well. And I always thought that was a tremendous combination.
Did anybody recommend to you, or did your style just come organically, naturally on delivery, on cadence, on style? Because within my industry, it's always kind of changed a little bit. You want to be very true to your personality and your persona. How did you kind of land at the very direct, very deep, very Again, just this very unique approach that you have when you are calling a game.
Well, I think some of the best advice I ever got from Bill Law, my predecessor with this job, was to be yourself. And my style is very different than what Bill's was. Bill was sort of folksy, which was a very unique style in and of itself, but you have to be who you are. And I think my years of being a newscaster have influenced my style in PA too.
Because you need to be really right down the middle, right? I mean,
Yeah,
you're
exactly.
employed by the Bulls. You're a cheerleader inside for the Bulls, but as far as your work
Yeah.
goes, your presentation, you're as 50-50 as they come.
Yeah, I try to show respect for both teams because that's the way I think it should be. Because I see the PA announcer as, in some respects, being like the official scorer, a person who's there to be the person of record in the game.
Yes.
And my style is very different. There is a style of cheerleading PA announcers that
Sure.
you hear in a lot of places. And but I can consider myself a traditional PA announcer, which goes back to the Marshall Man thing. And I've been so fortunate that I've been supported by the Bulls and a couple of other ballparks where I do PA and letting me do it the way I want to do it. And so that's been a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Yeah, I mean, you truly are Switzerland. You're the Switzerland of public address announcers, which is neutral, and I think it's the way it really should be. It raises an interesting point, saying that the Bulls and the people out in Surprise give you the autonomy to be yourself and stylistically be yourself. Have you ever encountered a job where you've been prodded to present things differently?
No, really not. And I've been very fortunate in that respect. And I think here with the Bulls, we have a wonderful way of doing it because I do my style, as you say, which is very traditional, but we also have Jatovia McDuffie, our on-field announcer, as sort of a cheerleader for the team. So I think the Bulls are able to meet both with have two different people in two different roles.
Yeah. Do you remember the first time you put on the headsets professionally? Because
Yes,
what do you remember? How old were you, and what was the circumstance behind that?
I was 18 years old, and I had gotten my first job in radio at what was a classical music station, as a matter of fact. So I'm probably one of the few people in the world that actually at one point worked at a classical station, another point worked at a country station. And that was all within my first 2 years in broadcasting. And of that 52 years I've been in broadcasting, all except those first 2 years, they've all been in spoken word format. Those were my only 2 years in music. But what a vast difference between classical and country.
So I've had certain situations since I've lived in the Triangle where, and this doesn't happen often, but it does happen more than a handful of times. I'll be at a grocery store shopping, getting diapers or getting cereal or whatever. And we'll say something at the checkout line to the person who's checking me out. And they'll do a double take and they'll recognize the voice. And a lot of times they'll be like, you're the broadcast for the Bulls, aren't you? And I don't promote it. I don't, I don't wear a lot of Durham Bulls stuff out in public. I mean, I'm just kind of my own self. And I'm sure that happens with Tony Riggsbee. You could probably place an order at Bojangles and you might get recognized by the person taking your order inside, right?
It's happened a few times, and they will go like, "I hear you at the ballpark," or "I hear you on the radio," and your name is Tony, right? And so it's sort of embarrassing, but it makes you feel good at the same time when that happens.
Do you get fan mail?
Years ago, early years in radio, but I get some emails occasionally from people, and particularly I'll get some emails from, one of the great things about being at press box is you meet a lot of scouts.
Yeah.
And I'll get an email occasionally from a scout. It'll just say, really appreciate the way you do the PA. And that means a lot to me because scouts are some of my favorite people in baseball.
Yeah. I mean, and you can talk baseball for months and you have this uncanny innate ability to remember every minute detail. And
well, I try to.
And how does that happen? I mean, have you conditioned your brain to remember things in a certain way, or does it just happen naturally for you?
I've always had a good rote memory. I am awful at anything that involves a calculation or a formula or something like that. But if it's straight memory, I'm very good at it. That's why I was much better on my verbal SAT than I was on my math
Okay.
SAT.
So give our fans an idea what a everyday, not that they're all the same, but what kind of the TikTok of a day for Tony Riggsbee is at Durham Bulls Athletic Park.
Well, I usually get to the ballpark between 3:30 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And the first thing I do is go upstairs and get all my stuff laid out because I'm very much a creature of habit. I've got to have everything in the same spot every day. And then I go and get your great notes and rosters and the lineups that are usually there when I get there at 4 o'clock, and I get my scorebook ready. Get my scripts ready. Usually the script is there on the desk when I come in. I have to have it in a 3-ring binder, so I have to punch holes. That's just one of my quirks.
Yeah.
I have to do it out of a 3-ring binder. And they asked me a few years ago if I'd like to have a computer screen to read it off a computer. But no, I got to have it on paper. I got to read it out of that binder. But then I try to get everything ready as quickly as possible. And then when some of the scouts start coming in and the other folks get a chance to have conversations with them, Patrick, I love baseball so much, and I love being at the ballpark, but I love the baseball people most of all. And I think if I weren't doing that, that's what I would miss the most.
Who are some of your favorite baseball people? Because you come across so many.
Well, I mentioned earlier Miles Wolff, who was the former owner of the Bulls for a long time, Dave Chase. I have former scouts, former umpires who are good. Adam Dowdy, former International League umpire, is a good
Pontiac,
friend.
Illinois native.
Yes,
That's my
exactly.
hometown.
You and I are both good friends. It was great to see him when he came over here to do the ACC tournament a year ago. But I run into Adam in Arizona a lot because that's where he lives, and where I do games in the fall league and in spring training. Then there are a lot of people who are working the ballpark who are very good friends, like Mike Elledge, who's one of our stringers, has become a very, very good friend of mine. Sean Crest, Brent Belvin, who's been the official scorer even longer than I've been with the Bulls. He's been the official scorer since 1989. But then I love some of the other broadcasters who come in too. Scott from Jacksonville is one of my favorites. Don't get to see him anymore, but Jim Weber with Toledo, it was always just fantastic. Jim's the only one of the visiting broadcasters who's ever had me on his broadcast, by the way. But that was fun. He would do that once a year when he would come in. And of course, Miss Howard from Indianapolis coming in because of the structure of the league now. We just don't see those teams on a yearly basis like we used to. And then I've gotten to know some of the major league broadcasters from my work in spring training. Matt Hicks with the Texas Rangers has become a good friend too. And Steve Stewart with the Royals. Always enjoy talking to them. So it's just a lot of people in the game that I really, really like.
You mentioned you're a creature of habit, and I mentioned this when we had Jim Morris on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. That when he returned to pro baseball in 1999, 10 years after he blew out his arm, and the Disney movie sprung from his resurgence and getting to the big leagues. His first game back was at Double-A with Orlando, and it was at Five County Stadium, and it was against the Mudcats, and I was the Mudcats broadcaster then, and have that scorebook with Jim Morris, because the story was I went the next day, couldn't find out anything about him. I was scouring the internet, couldn't find anything, and went to him the following day after that first game back in 10 years and said, who are you? Where have you been? Long story short, I've saved every scorebook since I started broadcasting. I don't have the first couple, but beginning in 1990, I think 7 with Kane County. So my first 4 years from Clinton, for some reason I can't find. But since then, I've saved every scorebook. They're in a closet, and it's like you. I mean, I'm very orderly. It has to be exactly the way it is. Colored pens, and it's the single bind.
You and I are both very much into the colored pens.
We really are. So I mean, do you save scores? I mean, you keep score of the games. Do you save your scripts? What all do you save, and how big must your attic be to handle all these things?
Well, fortunately, I live in a relatively big house, so I got a room for that. But I don't save all my old scripts. I save some of them. I save, a sample or two from each season. like for instance, last year I did the Arizona Fall League All-Star game and the Arizona Fall League Championship game. I saved special scripts like that. One of my favorite things, I've saved all my scorebooks, but I only have one framed though, and that was from my first spring training game, the first major league game that I did. I have my score sheet from that, and I got the two managers to sign it for me. Ron Washington, who was then the manager of the Rangers, and Ned Yost, who was then the manager of the Kansas City Royals. So that's one of my favorite possessions. And I've got that one framed at home. And I know you have a couple framed in the booth at the ballpark.
Yeah, it's basically every championship determining Durham Bulls score sheet. Yeah, so they're in a frame on the wall, and I'm running out of wall space because the Bulls are winning so frequently.
Exactly.
But
we are so spoiled with the Bulls. I mean, you talk to people in baseball who've never gotten a ring, and we've gotten so many of them over the years.
Yeah, I need to grow another hand.
Yeah, exactly. Tampa Bay Rays have been great to us.
So, and speaking from experience, I love baseball. I've done it for many, many years. But there are some days where I'm just not really in a baseball mood when there's a baseball game. So I know you haven't missed many games over your career in your 19 years with the Bulls, but are there days where you'd rather be somewhere else, where it just, you're tired, you're sick, or something comes up where, gosh, I wish we had a rain out, or I wish I had an off day today?
Yeah, I occasionally feel that way, but not very often. Fortunately, they're very few and far between. But then if I do feel that way, I try to tell myself, look, do you realize how lucky you are?
Yeah.
Be at the ballpark every day and be paid to do it. By the way, in my 19 years, I've only missed one game.
Tell me about that. What's the one game you missed in 19 years? What were the circumstances?
The one game was I was going to be the co-MC of the North Carolina Sports Hall of Fame induction ceremony. So I contacted Mike Burling months in advance and told him I'm going to have to miss this game. So my predecessor, Bill Law, came back and did that one game.
So doing some quick math, because I know if I asked you, you may not be able to calculate it since you mentioned math wasn't your strong suit.
No, that's not my strong suit.
But so 18 and a half years, about 70 home games a year. We're talking about 1,260-ish games. You've missed one.
I've missed one, yes.
Is that why you and Jim Weber get along so well? Because Jim Weber hasn't missed a game in 40, 41 years?
Plus, we're old guys, too. I think that's the other reason. But no, I've always taken pride in that, of still going into work. You don't feel that good some days. And I've, in my years in radio, I've taken, I think, 3 sick days in 50-some years in radio. It's a point of personal pride with me, I guess. It might be stubbornness more than anything too. But no, I've been very, very lucky to have had a lot of good health too.
Did you feel guilty the game you missed? I mean, was it in the back of your mind as you're emceeing that event?
Yeah, I did. I was thinking I wish I could be both places at the same time. But Mike Burling was so gracious about arranging for that. So yeah, but I did hate missing that game too, because I like keeping the streak going.
So and by the way, what is the streak up to now?
I don't really know because I've got to add in my spring training and Arizona Fall League games too, and I've never missed a game either of those places. So I'm going to have to calculate. But like I say, rote memory is my thing, not the calculation. Sometimes.
Send me the numbers. I'll take care of the math. Are there other events? And again, growing up, baseball was always my number one thing, but then I kind of morphed into other events and having the opportunity to call Olympics and having the opportunity to work on network TV. That's been such a point of privilege and honor for me. And there are still things that I want to do before, I move on to something else in or outside of this industry. Are there other events, sporting events, venues you want to work in, other events you'd like to take a swing at being the public address announcer outside of baseball? What's on your bucket list?
I would love to be the public address announcer at a major event like the Super Bowl or something like that. Now, my first thing would be to do a regular season major league game. I've done hundreds of major league spring training games, but I would love to do a regular season major league game too. And then I have some things outside of sports that putting my news hat on too. I would love to be a moderator of a campaign debate too. There are a lot of those things I would love to do, but I've been lucky to be able to do the things that I've done over the years too. But still, one of the great things is to have those things you would still like to do because I think that keeps you young.
And it's interesting you bring that up because I was going to ask you this because I don't know the answer, but there is an organist in Rochester, Fred Costello, who is an unbelievably talented pianist. He's had the opportunity to be an organist for major league teams, for NHL teams, for NBA teams. He just loves Rochester so much. That seems to be his spot. So he's had those opportunities. It would be shocking to me to hear that somebody with your history and your voice and your presentation hasn't had the opportunity to call major league games. Is that something that you have applied for and haven't landed those jobs, or have you not pursued it as much, or is that not the end all be all for Tony Riggsbee to get to the major leagues?
It's not the end all be all for me. I feel very, very fortunate to have been around Major League Baseball with spring training for so many years. I would love to do it on a just to say I've done it a couple of times, but it's not something that I'm losing sleep about because I think I have a great job right now. I love doing AAA baseball, and yeah, I love the major leagues, but I'm very, very happy with what I.
Okay. As we wind things down with Tony Riggsbee, first off, so thankful for your time. I want to switch to the news side just for a second because you've been such a staple in bringing news to millions of people throughout the Triangle for decades. And I don't know the answer to this, but I'm assuming you have been on the air for some of the more watershed moments in our lives, whether it be the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, whether it be 9/11, whether it be a stock market collapse, whether it be something, a president being shot. I don't know. What are some of those seminal moments where you have been on the air and had to be the voice to deliver news to people of the Triangle?
I think the two that stand out to me, and you mentioned one of them with 9/11. I was in the newsroom on that day in 2001. I had just finished my morning news shift, and I was actually out in the newsroom getting ready to edit some football coaches tape for a program that I used to do called Football Countdown, too, with the area football coaches. So I was working on that, and then I heard the network bulletin on that, and I'm thinking, well, we've got to get on the air and we got to stay on the air with this. So I went in, and my late colleague Mike Blackman and I, we sort of co-anchored coverage until CBS established continuous radio coverage. And so I guess we were on for about 35 minutes before the network came in with full coverage. And I just remember in that thinking back about some of the things we were talking about, and I remembered this was before we knew that it was definitely terrorism. We just knew that the World Trade Center had been hit by a plane. So I was recounting, I remember on the air, the fact that a plane had hit the Empire State Building during World War II. And this was a small plane, though, not an airliner, but it did a tremendous amount of damage, and one person was killed in that. So we were still speculating, was this something like this, or was it terrorism? And then we got the word that the second tower had been hit, too. The other one that I remember was earlier, and one of the few times on the old wire machines before they were on computer, when you had the printout with the clackers, and the only time I ever remember seeing, rather than bulletin, flash, and that was when the Space Shuttle Challenger had its disaster. So we had to get on and do something on that too. And those are the two that come to mind most readily, I think, for me.
Yeah, that was my 16th birthday.
Really?
Challenger. Yep.
Yeah,
January 28th, 1986.
Yeah.
And even then, and oddly, I was such a huge fan of the Space Shuttle program that when it started in 1981, I would get up, I would set alarms for every launch and every landing and would not miss it because it was carried on national TV, on network TV, because it was such a novel concept of, machine going back into space, reusable, and they send it back up every,
That's the way
nine
I
months,
had
six
been
months.
as a kid with the Mercury, Gemini, and
Yeah.
Apollo programs, and watching all of those broadcasts, watching Walter Cronkite anchor the coverage of.
From colored pens to sports to space, Tony. We're living parallel lives, a couple of decades
Exactly.
apart. But yeah, so I was as much as an expert could be when you're 12 or 13 years of age on the space shuttle program. That was me.
Yeah,
So when the shuttle blew up on, with the O-rings and blew up on January 20th, 1986, I could not have been more crestfallen. I mean, I was
it was a shock.
absolutely devastated when that happened.
Yeah, it's just something you'll never ever forget. And of course, back in my pre-broadcast days when I was just a kid, the event that I remember most vividly was, of course, the assassination of President Kennedy when I was in the fifth grade. But as a professional, having to deal with those two, Challenger and 9/11, are the ones that stand out the most.
Yeah. How has your industry in both sports and news changed in the last, let's just say, the last 10 years?
It's changed a lot, although if I span it back to 20 years
Okay.
or 25 years, it has changed exponentially because of the advent of digital. When I first got into the business, we were having the reel-to-reel tapes, the grease pencils, the razor blades to edit tape, which would take forever. And if you have chubby fingers like me, it wasn't that easy to do to splice that tape together. Now it's so easy with the Adobe and all of the editing projects that we have now. That's changed exponentially. But also the amount of time we have has probably gone down in terms of the amount of time we have to do news. So it's sort of been a trade-off. In some respects, it's easier because digital is much easier than the old system. But in terms of having to learn to write short, particularly for newscasts, to get the same amount of it's a little more difficult. You view it as a challenge, and now I'm always preaching to the people in our newsroom: economy of words. Say it short, be flowery, because we need to get more stories in.
Do you have a studio in your house?
I do not. It's something I've thought about doing, but I've just never gotten around to it because I've always, even during COVID, we had some of our radio people who were working from home, but I still went into the station every day during COVID.
Have you ever narrated audiobooks? It seems like you would be the poster child for audiobook narration.
I've never narrated an audiobook. I have narrated some special programs over the years on different documentary type projects, but never an audiobook. But that's something I wouldn't mind doing. It would be a challenge to do that.
Yeah. What were your hobbies as a kid? I mean, obviously baseball was a big part of your upbringing, but like me, people may not have known that I was such a space shuttle aficionado. What were some of the hobbies kind of outside of baseball that piqued your interest when you were a small child?
Politics. I was very much into politics as a kid, and I think that's one of the things that stirred me to want to have a career doing news too. From the time I was a little kid, I was collecting campaign buttons, following the elections very, very closely. I still have a lot of those campaign buttons from the 1960s when I was a kid too. But that was, and my biggest hobby then and now, aside from sports, and that is reading. I'm a huge reader. One of the most pleasant things to me is to go out on my front porch with a book on a nice day and just read.
Are you reading fiction or nonfiction?
Primarily nonfiction. I
Okay.
love biographies. And what I tend to do is I tend to read a baseball book and then a history book or a politics book. And then go back to a baseball book next, so that I'm happy to read this, but I want to get back to this one too. So it's my parallel life of news and baseball. I try to them both in my reading program too.
It makes all the most rational sense. So, what would be the top 3 books, both fiction and nonfiction, for you, Tony?
My favorite baseball book of all time was a book that was written in the late 70s called Bush League, about minor league baseball in general. So that would be my favorite baseball book of all time. My favorite biography of all time was Margaret Truman's biography of her father, simply called Harry S. Truman by
Hmm.
Margaret Truman. That
Hmm.
was my favorite there. And terms of a work of fiction, that's harder for me. And I've read a lot of fiction over the years, but doesn't have the impact on me that
Hmm.
that nonfiction has.
Hmm.
Speaking of books, Patrick, we are so lucky. No minor league team in the world has had as many books
Yeah.
written
Yeah.
about it as the Durham Bulls, including
Hmm.
one that's out new this year by one of our Seeding Bowl hosts from a
Hmm.
couple of years ago.
Yeah, I had Mr. Cooper on the podcast about a month and a half ago to talk about that.
And just a couple of years ago, Ron Morris wrote that
Yeah.
great book about the 1980 Bulls called No Bull.
Hmm.
And it goes way, way back. So not only are the Bulls the best known minor league team, the team
Yeah.
with most books too.
Yeah. Are you in the market for writing a book? I mean, do you keep a diary? Do you keep notes on things? Because that
I
would be
don't
a very unique perspective.
I don't keep a diary, but I do have a lot of notes on things. And, I've thought about that, particularly if I could dictate it rather than having to write it out by hand. I think it is something I would like to do. And of course, with the computer programs we have now,
Yeah.
it's not something I rule out. It would be of
Yeah.
interest.
Well, I think I know a guy who might be able to audio narrate that book, Tony.
Really? Who might that
Yeah,
be?
I think he's sitting in your chair right now.
Yeah. I would enjoy that part of it the most.
Yeah. So as we wind down with Tony, first off, Bill Law was the PA broadcaster for how long for Durham?
Bill became the PA announcer in 1995 when we
Okay.
moved into the new ballpark. He did it for 12 years.
Okay.
I've done it longer than him now. So I think I can say I've done it longer than anybody in Bulls history. I don't think anybody else has done it for 19 years. If they did, it was back in the 20s or 30s, something like. But I'll claim it until somebody
Yeah,
tells me.
absolutely. So two-part final question for you. How much longer do you want to keep doing this? And then I'll say the second part for after your answer.
Well, I want to keep doing it as long as I can do it and do it well. I don't want to ever embarrass myself. So
Mm.
as long as I can do it and do it well, I love it so much. I have no plans to give it up voluntarily.
Okay. Well, let me insert then a follow-up question to question one before I get to the other one. I'm like this as well. I think anybody in our industry is like this. You could do a game. You could do PA for a Bulls game. I could do play-by-play for an event. And I'm in the car driving home, and I wish I had this moment back, or I wish I used this term or this phrase or something differently. Do you do that? How do you self-critique? And you mentioned as long as I do this job well, you'll keep doing it. What does that mean to Tony Riggsbee? What does not doing the job well, what would that even sound like?
That would be being inaccurate, misidentifying people on a consistent. We all do it occasionally. We are all going to make mistakes, but doing it on a consistent basis, uh, being in a situation where I was embarrassed by what I had done, as long as that doesn't happen, I want to keep doing it.
So for my next question, before you were brought in to kind of co-man the chair with Bill that one transition year and then take over, without naming names, do you have somebody in the back of your mind who, whenever that day comes when Tony Riggsbee says, you know what, let's move on and do something else, is there somebody in the back of your mind like Bill Law and Mike Burling had who you would recommend being the next institution of Durham Bulls baseball as the PA announcer?
Actually, there are a couple of people that
And you
would
don't need
hope
to name them,
yeah,
but if you
yeah,
want to,
I'm not
fine.
going to because I don't have their permission. But there are a couple of people that I think would do a fine job with it.
Mhm.
If they were interested, and I've never talked to either one of them about it, but it is something that I've thought about because I would hope that they would follow along in the same tradition.
Interesting. All right. And before I let you go, this will be the ultimate last question. I'd be remiss if I did not ask you, what are your favorite Durham Bulls memories of your 18 and a half years with the Bulls?
In terms of an individual event or in general?
Could be anything.
Well, I think it's probably doing my first Bulls PA game was one of my great memories, but also doing the AAA National Championship game.
Mhm.
And handling the AAA All-Star game when they came in, but also having the chance just to talk on a daily basis with some of the great people we've had. And I think
Mhm.
particularly uh, two Hall of Fame managers,
Yeah.
Charlie Montoya, and especially the man I still call the skipper and always will call the skipper, Bill Evers.
Yeah, I mean, two of the absolute greats, and they were on the podcast as we started back in February. And I guess the last question for you. Notice how I keep saying last question, last question. I know you're dying for your nap. Last question. You mentioned your first game as the Bulls PA announcer as being your favorite memory. What do you remember about that first game?
I just remember being nervous about doing it because I'd been on the radio for a long time, but I hadn't done a whole lot of PA at that point. I had done a few games for NC State women's basketball on PA, but I'd been a play-by-play guy more than I'd ever been a PA guy at that point. So it was a little intimidating, but I would say within the first 3 games I did it, I felt at home at that point, and I realized, boy, I should have been doing this all along. This is a lot of fun.
Well, Tony, it is such a blast to work with you on a daily basis at the DBAP. Thank you for pushing off your nap for another 30 minutes or so to join us and sharing some memories.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks for having me.
So that's Tony Riggsbee, the 19-year public address announcer of the Durham Bulls, on this edition of the Durham Bulls podcast. Again, subscribe. It really helps us out if you do on Spotify, and on Apple, and on Durham Bulls TV, which is our YouTube channel. You'll get instant notifications when these new episodes drop. So for Jacoby McDuffie, who's our post-production wizard, for Tony Riggsbee and everybody behind the Durham Bulls podcast, I'm Patrick Keenis. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week on the Durham Bulls podcast.